listening to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
This is the Pain Pod.
You want to see pain? Look at these.
Welcome to the Pain Pod, the podcast for all things pain management. Hosted by the Pain Guy, Dr. Mark Garofoli. We'll be collaborating with numerous pain management experts, talking about substance usage disorders, the latest treatment modalities, and most important, focusing on the pain of our patients as leading providers of pain care. And now, here's our host, a man wanted in all 50 states, a suburban city-like mountain man.
Without the beard.
From the hills of West Virginia, and certified in weapons of mass destruction response. It's Dr. Mark Garofoli.
All right, welcome back, Pain Pod Nation. We are coming in hot today. One hot topic, really about 50,000 hot topics, all centered around cannabis, cannabinoids, and the whole genre. So for our Pain Pod episode today, we have Thug Drugs, Cannabis Edition. All right, so for any conversation, well, that requires words, and words matter, right? Spelling matters too. We've talked about that on previous episodes. For Just Say No with a K-N-O-W. Same kind of theme here today, of course, but well, to have a conversation, we want to make sure to have the right words in all the conversations and all the headlines across the country. We know many will be occurring throughout the years, particularly in 2024. But, it's kind of like when we talk about opiate and opioids. Opiate is anything in the poppy, morphine, codeine, thebaine. It's pretty much your heavy hitters. Everything else is opioids, and we typically say opioids for everything else, right? Yet that's not what the headlines and the manuscript articles and all this stuff just gets it wrong, right? Alas, conversations and research can continue, right? But when it comes to all things cannabis, let's wrap our heads around some of the words mattering first. So, as a pharmacist, we'll spell this one, I guess, in the farmer sense, but with a PH. So, going to botany. So, genus and species when it comes to all things cannabis. We're talking the genus being cannabis. And then there's different species. So, it's the same kind of thing that we talk about with other plants. I don't know about you, but I grew up growing some maters, tomatoes, tomato. Hey, words matter, right? But growing those with my grandpa out in his garden. And then, of course, there are at farmers markets and grocery stores these days across the country. But there's a lot of different species. You got your Roma, you got your cherry tomatoes, you got your beefsteak, personal favorite, of course. But anyways, when it comes to cannabis, we're talking things like cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, cannabis ruderalis, and the reality these days that there's hybrids of everything. Okay. Lots of variety out there. Now, what about some other words? When we hear hemp, what are we thinking then? Well, that's cannabis sativa. Just like when we're talking about CBD, it's all about the cannabis sativa portion. Whereas when we're hearing things like marijuana or weed or THC, there we're typically, talking about things, like all species, all the types of cannabis species, genus species, along with the hybrids, really concentrating on things like THC as a component along the way. And of course, when you say something like cannabinoids, that's all species or even endocannabinoids. We'll touch on a hot second, of course. But a big one. Here's a big one. And we don't hear this word a lot, but we hear the description a lot. Semi-synthetic cannabinoids. What the heck is that? Well, just like any other substance, medication, or anything like that, semi-synthetic cannabinoid would be something that's derived typically from CBD within cannabis sativa. That's enabled by the Farm Bill back in the day, not that long ago. To put CBD out there just about everywhere, and labs or various organizations will start with CBD and then make it other things, and that's where we get a lot of the products that are out there these days. All right. So what about there's two other big things when we're talking about, terminology here. There's cannabis-based medication and there's medical cannabis or medical marijuana. So cannabis-based medication, that's the stuff that's FDA approved. We have had FDA-approved cannabinoids for a good while now. Some might say for some time. Well, that sounds subjective, right? But the cannabis-based medication could be also referred to as cannabis-derived medications. We're talking about things like our Marinol formulations, and then, of course, the natural extracted CBD of Epidiolex for pediatric seizure conditions, so on and so forth. Those are reviewed and more expensive. Let's be real, right? Then you have medical cannabis or medical marijuana. That's pretty much everything that's out there, right? In the other supply chain. Lots of movement happening and coming when it comes to that genre in our country. So let's whittle it down back to some more botany, okay? Obviously, we get our cannabinoids from the cannabis genus of plants. Turns out there's some other plants that actually will include those as well. Anybody got any rhododendrons out in their yard or go hiking, perhaps on the East Coast, particularly around June? I think it's around Father's Day when the rhododendrons bloom. They're absolutely beautiful if you go for a hike in the particularly areas like Pennsylvania, West Virginia. That's my experience where I'm from, of course. It's absolutely beautiful to walk through the woods, enjoy the forest, and seeing those blooming. They got a little bit in there. Certainly not going to be utilized in the same fashion as cannabis plants, but there's other plants that have them as well too. Now, speaking of the plants, let's take a little hot tub time machine here back to the colonial times. Our founding forefathers made a decision to go with cotton, right? As far as all the industrial utilizations and a big part of our country's history, quite frankly. But could have made the choice to go with hemp seeds or hemp stalks or just hemp in general, right? It quite industrial. Some might say easier to grow, more efficient to grow, better for the environment to grow, and making products that could be utilized pretty much wherever cotton is utilized, and a couple more as well too. So yes, the history of America really can have roots. The puns are everywhere, folks. In all things cannabis. Speaking of history, of course, we have thoughts overall with regulation or big picture. Lots of movement with that over the years or attempts thereof. So even when decisions are made, they can be changed. We look no further than ethyl alcohol. Over 100 years ago, it was legal, and then we made it illegal, and then we got it back to legal, right? Same chemical, same stuff, subjective, and applying it to a current society along the way. We're experiencing those ideas now with, and have been with cannabis as well. Nothing new, folks. Typically, though, the extremes are what happen. And when there's prohibition or legalization without any restrictions, that's when there's the most potential harm to society. Somewhere in the middle that we get the least harm to society overall. Now, I mentioned some history, the whole founding forefathers. Folks like our very well-known presidents, so on and so forth. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, they're all known growers of hemp. In fact, I was told by a pharmacist who volunteers at Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia that they actually talk about that on the tours there. Pretty cool, right? Hemp was actually legal tender in a couple states like Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, I believe, too. It was in U.S. tinctures and medications at a very high percentage of those tinctures and medicines over 100 years ago. I read somewhere where it was about 6% of all medications or drugs contained cannabis extract about 100 years ago. Think about that. Then our neighbors to the south, Mexico banned the production, sale, and recreational use of cannabis back in the 1920s. Yeah. And then about half of our states outlawed marijuana. In fact, there was the 1937 Marijuana Act. I'm emphasizing the terminology there because it was spelled with an H. Because that's actually marijuana. Marijuana is a stigmatic term. It's derived from Mexican Spanish. But anyways, with the Tax Act in 1937, transferred, it basically brought government and money into the picture. Transfers of marijuana were taxed like narcotics. Farmers would purchase at a $1 tax stamp. Now, again, think about this. It's 1937. A dollar was a lot different then, right? These days you can't even get anything in the dollar store for $1 or any of those stores, right? Prescribers and dispensers were also taxed on sales at that time, too. Fast forward to like the 70s, we had the Waldos come up with 420 as they gathered outside of the Louis Pasteur statue out in California at their high school campus. Just picked a time, and then that was sensationalized by High Times magazine, and that's where we get the 420 term these days, referring to cannabis utilization. Fast forward to next big one will probably be 1996. That's when California legalized medical marijuana. First state to do so, to have any movement on the legislation side. Then we had about a decade ago, the DEA basically, re-looked at the idea of reclassifying cannabis, marijuana, so on and so forth. But there was no, general acceptance of medical utilization at the time, so it continued to be a CS1. That's where a lot of questions come in. How could something be illegal at the federal level, yet we see it everywhere in society, right? Well, that's because Congress typically appropriates $1 as far as a budget for the enforcement of that law. Enforcement is a big thing as well, too. 2018 was the Farm Bill. Mentioned that earlier. That's allowed CBD being derived from hemp as long as the THC content was less than 0.3%, and it would be basically legal to sell as a cosmetic. Now, when those sales happened and continue to happen, of course, there's always the big idea of big marijuana money, right? And we're talking tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for states. The other side of the coin that nobody talks about is that that's still a small percentage, usually less than actually almost always less than 1% of a given state's budget. Because running a state is a lot, there's a higher electric bill than my house. I don't know about yours. I hope so, right? So two sides of the coin there. You'll always get that from Pain Guy, right? I mentioned 1996 was when California got the ball rolling. These days, even as far as back in 2023, it's only about 6-7 states that didn't have any movement in legislation when it came to marijuana, cannabis overall. But big picture. I always like to quote Dr. Nora Volkow. We actually had her on an episode of the Pain Pod. Wonderful conversation. Check that out back in the day. But here's a quote that was in an article for her, but it was also at a graduation speech for a university. She had mentioned legal drugs, that's alcohol and tobacco, offer a sobering perspective, accounting for the greatest burden of disease associated with drugs, not because they are more dangerous than illegal drugs, but because their legal status allows for more widespread exposure. Think about that. Leads me to the next thought of, the court of public opinion when it comes to all things cannabis, the ship has sailed, folks, right? Because the court of public opinion moves much faster than the law, right? So we got to keep that in mind overall. It's regardless of the pharmacology, the science, the legislation, the sense of things along the way, the court of public opinion is what really shifts things with impetus. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's go over something that perhaps could be covered in health classes in like middle school, the endocannabinoid system, the ECS. Just like any other body system that us humans have, like the skeletal system, muscular skeletal system, so on and so forth. It's there, okay? It's in us. You got the CB1 and CB2 receptors. I usually say, remembering CB1, the physical numeral number 1 is tall and narrow. So that's a way to remember that the CB1 receptors are typically in the CNS, whereas 2, the numeral 2 is a little bit wider, to remember that CB2 receptors are typically out in the immune system and GI tract. We also have things like TRPV1 coming into play, G-coupled proteins, just like we see with opioids, PPARs, fatty acid binding proteins. There's a whole bunch of receptors that are out there, just like there's a bunch of enzymes as well within our human ECS, endocannabinoid system. There's 2 builder enzymes and there's 2 breaker enzymes, basically. You're going to synthesize endocannabinoids in our body naturally, and then they're going to be degraded to things like arachidonic acid, think NSAID cascade or steroid cascade, right? So yes, in our body we have endocannabinoids. There's really 2 main ones. There's anandamide or AEA, and then there's 2-arachidonoglycerol. Let's just call that puppy 2AG. Okay. That anandamide, the word comes from Sanskrit for bliss, joy, or delight, and it ends with amide because you got some nitrogen going on there, right? The 2AG, I promise to not say 2-arachidonoglycerol again. That's basically arachidonic acid. Again, think steroid NSAID cascade, along with diacetylglycerol. A little addition. But these are in our bodies, okay? Turns out there's actually another, there's an endogenous cannabinoid reuptake inhibitor. Say that one again and bring it up at any holiday dinner, right? Think like SSRI, but ECRI if you really want to go along that way. That's actually one of the active metabolites of acetaminophen. What? Yeah. Those medications that are grandfathered in that, we did we ever, put the info down on text? Well, how's it work? Well, we have our thoughts, of course, and we're pretty good at it, but All right. So that's the endocannabinoids. Let's hop, skip, and jump on over to the phytocannabinoids. What's in the plants? The mothership, CBGA, cannabigerolic acid. That's the one that ends up in the plant being converted to other things like CBG we hear about, CBN we hear about, but our two heavy hitters, of course, THC and CBD. Unless anyone's been living under a rock, we've heard those words before, right? Now, the structures for THC and CBD are pretty similar when you look at them on a flat piece of paper. I'm told when they are in the 3D form, they're a tad bit different. But there's, I usually say, think of a balloon with a string on it. Like when a kid loses a balloon at an amusement park or something, it floats up in the air, or that one Disney movie Up, I think. Think of that. The core structure, the balloon, has a little change in one of the rings or the opening of the ring. And then the tail, it doesn't necessarily change when you're looking at THC and CBD, but other derivatives it does. So how do THC and CBD work? So THC, pretty straightforward, I guess. It's a partial agonist. We remember that term from things like buprenorphine. But hey, we got a whole Pain Pod episode on that one, right? So I won't bang the drum on partial agonism here today, but THC is a partial agonist at CB1 and CB2. Remember, we just mentioned those. CBD, really different. CBD is an antagonist at CB1, so literally the opposite of THC. And then it's also a what I'd call a backseat driver for CB2. But in pharmacological senses, we call that a negative allosteric modulator. CBD is a negative allosteric modulator at CB2. What the heck does that mean? It means it's a backseat driver. It'll bind somewhere near the receptor site and cause the opposite effect. It's a backseat driver, folks. All right, so THC and CBD, we got the structures and how they're working, mechanisms, and all that. What about the products? Let's get to the shelves here for whatever building they're available in. So CBD products, there's different extraction methods. Number one, old school, still done today though, is things like ethanol, hydrocarbon. The list goes on. Supercritical carbon dioxide though is one of the not really newer, but the presumably safer. It's similar to a pharmaceutical product process where the carbon dioxide is pushed through the cannabis material to extract the exact cannabinoids. That's typically what we're looking for in case you're able to find out how a CBD product is extracted. Now, the products, though, here's the big thing. Okay, on the labeling, you're either going to see, I call this FBI. You're either going to see full spectrum, broad spectrum, or isolate. Okay. Full spectrum means that the product is labeled to contain all cannabinoids, not just CBD, not just THC, but all of them, any of them. Broad spectrum is just like that, but it won't have THC. So as per the labeling, broad spectrum would be CBD, maybe some other cannabinoids, but not THC. And of course, the CBD isolate is labeled to just have CBD. So full spectrum, everything, broad spectrum, everything but THC, isolate, just CBD when we're talking about CBD products. Now, that being said, there's been some pretty big studies every year for the last few years going over labeling accuracy. We're talking things like JAMA, even FDA, so on and so forth. And it's still not there, folks. The labeling accuracy of CBD products that are readily available out there is just not there yet. There's a lot of darts missing the target. But capitalism is improving that. That's the other side of the coin. It's been improving in accuracy. It's just not accurate enough yet. All right. How about helping out our friends, family, customers, patients? Consumer Reports actually has a guide for shopping for CBD. I'll put it in the show notes here for us. One of the things somebody's going to be looking at, though, beyond that FBI, full, broad, and isolate products, you want to have a certificate of analysis. The long, boring, almost looks like an Excel spreadsheet to say, hey, what's in the product? Think urine drug monitoring report, but for a CBD product. Okay, really, and that's where we see what's actually in the products. THC, on the other hand, well, here's something they didn't teach in middle school health class, not just the ECS, but what's the difference between a joint, blunt, and a spliff? Yeah, we just said joint. It's pain pod, folks. We got to go over this stuff to help society. So joint is actually cannabis rolled up inside of a thin rolling paper. That's it. Whereas a blunt is a tobacco leaf roll with cannabis inside. So you're getting tobacco and cannabis. Spliff, on the other hand, a little different. That's tobacco and cannabis mixed together in the rolling paper. So like a joint, but like a blunt. You get a spliff. The more you know. There's also for THC formulations, there's hashish or hash oil. That's really high concentration things. We see other products now. They're the extractions or the oils are put into various different things. You get cook with them. People make pizza, muffins, gummy bears, of course, brownies, right? You didn't need this episode to know that. But then we also see things like candy that looks just like regular candy on the lower shelves at the grocery checkout. If anybody still goes to a grocery store and doesn't do delivery, right? And that's one of the issues is that a lot of the products will look just like something that doesn't have THC in it, yet it'll have a high content of it. Got to think about our kiddos, right? Speaking of which, there's a lot of synthetic cannabinoids. We touched on endocannabinoids, phytocannabinoids. Might as well talk about the synthetic ones, right? That's where things like Scooby Snacks come into play. I used to go about educating just about every Walmart cashier in Morgantown, West Virginia, when I would bring gummy Scooby Snacks readily available everywhere. For human consumption. When I'd be teaching about all things cannabis, I'd say, hey, here you go, to everybody out in the audience. The idea is that Scooby Snacks is also a term for synthetic marijuana. That product will have Scooby looking a little bit different on the thing. But then also, you got to keep in mind, there's also Scooby Snack graham crackers and dog treats. So, you got 4 options. There's the gummy ones, the graham ones. That's for us humans. Synthetic marijuana, synthetic cannabinoids, maybe not. And certainly don't want to have the dog treats, right? What about some other synthetic cannabinoids out there these days? So everybody's heard about Delta 8. Put a delta with any number, really. You're just changing a double bond in the main structure of THC. Remember the balloon with the string? It's up in the balloon in the rings. You change where a double bond is, and that obviously could have a lot of effects, whether we're talking blood-brain barrier or actual effects along the way. There's also THCO or THCO acetate. That's not actually found in plants. It's semi-synthetic, derived from good old hemp, CBD. That could be about 3 times more potent with a longer half-life or longer effects than typical THC. And typically folks that are said to report psychedelic trip-like experience with utilization. Been around for decades, though, but picking up some speed these days. There's a lot of different synthetic cannabinoid derivatives for CBD and THC. There's just a lot of them, like, dozens. And they are classified as far as structures and then who made them along the way as well. So what about, we went over history, a little bit of legal stuff, and then the pharmacology side. How about utilization and what we do, particularly as healthcare professionals, right? So is there a POP PDMP? Whoa, we shifted gears big time there, right? It wouldn't be a prescription drug monitoring program. There are, the FDA approved products within that, but I'm talking about like dispensaries. There's typically laws out there that, limit how much somebody can get in a given state. But then what about the tracking? There's no tracking set up to prevent someone from just hopping from dispensary to dispensary. That's actually referred to as looping. That's buying the maximum amount of cannabis products at a dispensary after dispensary after dispensary after dispensary. It's called looping. The more you know. All right. But again, there's synthetic and extracted products that are on the FDA approved side as well. Again, the dronabinol products, you got the capsules that are a CS3, liquid CS2. And then you have the extracted natural CBD product I mentioned earlier, which is no longer control, by the way. Internationally, we also have the nabiximols, which is a combination of THC and CBD. So just keeping that in mind. There's been a lot of studies out there particularly review articles in recent years, last 5 years or so. American Heart Association actually had a pretty good one back about 4 or 5 years ago. I think it was in 2020, during COVID times, that went over cannabinoid utilizations and basically said, here's a whole list of what's there's inconclusive evidence for utilization of cannabis cannabinoids. There's possible. And then there was known. The known ones were for pain, cachexia, nausea, vomiting, MS, and epilepsy. And if you notice, a lot of those actually are some of the indications for the FDA approved cannabinoids as well, right? There was a recent article that just in 2023 that was published, that went over the idea of CBD products not working in pain. So I'll include that in the show notes as well, too. Actually, that's on painguy.us, which you always want to check out painguy.us for headlines, resources, and the same. One other thing, there's also the one of the go-to, or if not the go-to for us healthcare professionals. There's the book called Cannabis and Medicine. The editor is Ken Finn, Dr. Ken Finn. A little drum roll. We're actually going to have him here on the Pain Pod really soon. Okay. We're going to go over specifically a whole conversation on cannabis, cannabinoids in pain management. So I'll jump away from that topic for now, but we'll have Ken here to dive a tad bit deeper. International all-star in the realm. But in the meantime, what do we do? What do we do as pharmacists? What do we do as healthcare professionals? Well, we typically worry about how something works and then the dose to then result in effects or efficacy and safety in regards to side effects and drug interactions. THC, CBD, cannabinoids have a plethora, hundreds, I'm told over 500 different drug-drug interactions that will pop up any drug-drug interaction checker. And in reality, which ones are clinically significant is a whole other ballgame. But that's a ballgame we're used to, particularly as pharmacists, right? There's fill a med order or dispense a prescription, and up comes the DRs, and there's lots of drug-drug interactions, right? We have to distinguish clinical significance. Same thing here with THC and CBD. Probably one of the easiest ways of going about that is to, you can utilize any of the drug-drug interaction online databases and see what they say. If you can't type in THC or CBD, you can always utilize the FDA-approved products that are in there. But there's a lot of CYP450, hepatic interactions with all the heavy hitters. You're talking like, 3A4, 2D6, so on and so forth. There's also protein binding interactions. That's actually a big one. Typically ends up with clinical significance along the way. And then sedatives. If you're talking about a THC product with sedative potential, you want to watch out for other medications with sedative properties as well. That's really the big bucket of the three ideas there: the CYPs, the protein binding, and the sedatives. As far as adverse effects, not going to insult anybody's intelligence there. I mean, certainly things like if it's THC, sedation, disorientation, dizziness, so on and so forth. There's also the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. I'm sure you've heard of that one recently, and really over the last decade a lot. The idea there is with these high potency products that are available, people are getting doses that are just through the roof. And that's leading to this CHS, cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, puking everywhere and always. Interestingly enough, what helps with that is extremely hot baths or showers. That's interesting. We're learning that perhaps the TRPV1 receptors come into play with that. Not quite there just yet, of course. I mentioned those, the high potency products. We'll probably end with that here today. So that's really a big one. Okay. You think about, let's go back to alcohol again. Okay. We had beer everywhere, and then it became illegal. And then liquor flourished at a much higher potency, or proof as we call it. And then things went back to legal and we had both. We're literally seeing the same things here with all things cannabis. Okay. There's most would say, well, the joint that your grandma smoked back, 50 years ago is different than today's. Absolutely. Just like anything else, we're getting higher potency in everything, just like cannabis products. And that's what's leading to a lot of concerns. It's not necessarily, all respect and compassion to those with any lives lost. It's not like the overdose death concerns. There's relatively minimal of that with all things cannabis. The concern is the high potency products leading to ER visits. Okay, that significantly affects somebody's life. Nobody wants to go to the ER for an experience that is not too enjoyable, right? So, some of the specifics in that regard, like a joint back in and I'll have the references in the notes here, folks, because again, it's general. But, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, a joint was probably about 2% THC. So you get like maybe 10 milligrams or so. Fast forward to like this decade, and they're probably about 10% THC. So you're getting about 50 milligrams. And then there's the extracts that have like 90%. So that's where we're seeing the concerns these days, right? By the way, if you look at some like the FDA approved products, you're talking like single digit milligrams as far as a dose for THC or CBD, generally speaking. So the way I'd end with it would be good old Charlie Brown. Our oldest son just loves watching Snoopy and Peanuts and all that. He's always saying good grief, right? Well, in this case, these days, it's big leaf, great grief, not just good grief. That's where our concerns are coming because it's all about the dosage, baby. You've heard me always talk about Paracelsus and paraphrasing him, of course. That's where we're at. It's all about the dosage and the relying on what the actual products are. So when we want to help our patients, we want to help our communities, our family and friends, and have those pivotal conversations. Hopefully some of the information we went over in this pretty quick episode here of the Pain Pod can help with that. We will follow up with a much more in-depth conversation on cannabis and cannabinoids within pain management. I promise you that, Pain Pod Nation. We'll have Dr. Ken Finn here. We'll be going into that much, much more. But hopefully this information here can help us all with all of our conversations and helping others across the country. So I thank you, for sticking through here in this episode, getting a little bit of a higher education, going above the smoke, above the fog. Yeah, the puns are always there, folks. But hopefully this information on all things cannabis, thug drugs, cannabis can really help all of us within our communities. Until the next time, folks, Pain Pod Nation, have a great day. Every day.
If you'd like to join Mark on the Pain Pod, send us an email to publisher at pharmacypodcast.com. And make sure to share the show and subscribe on your favorite podcast directory. Thanks for listening.